Much indeed to the organisers for inviting me to what is a really interesting conference. I think you've gathered together a great group of people. I want to address two things. What do we mean by proliferation, and what do we mean by risk, and how are the two things connected? And I have always seen proliferation as a two-dimensional approach, in that there is a vertical and horizontal dimension to proliferation. When I talk about proliferation, I'm not just talking about the spread to other countries. I'm talking about also the spread within countries, the spread perhaps to new types of weapon systems, the spreads to new capabilities, not just in terms of numbers. When we talk about risk, what we mean by that is quite clear. Risk is a mathematical equation. It is the probability times the consequence. And so you can have quite low probabilities, but with very high risks if the consequences are very high. That's really important to understand. The other thing to understand is, of course, that risk is not static. Risk changes. It changes with probability, and it changes as well with consequences. Consequences are different depending on the context. They're also different in terms of our perception. Risk is a prediction. We can be wrong about risk. We can be very wrong, as many of us know in our own lives, and we've seen in the wider world. But we try to predict what the risk is, and we have to factor in new information in terms of probabilities and in terms of consequences as they come in. I want to have a look at what the drivers are for proliferation. And there are many drivers for proliferation. There have been many drivers over the last 70 decades. A lot of it was about status, the issue of security, how security is perceived. A great deal of it is about the technical capability and technical prowess, if you like, in a time when nuclear was quite new. But I think at the very heart of all of this, it's about how we view nuclear weapons, whether it's in terms of status or whether it's in terms of security or in terms of prowess. And that also is true for whether these are domestic drivers or whether they're international or regional drivers. And I think that the idea of nuclear deterrence, the concept of nuclear deterrence, which is connected with this idea of nuclear exceptionalism, where nuclear weapons are exceptional, they're different to other types of weapons, is the underlying driver for some for proliferation. Now, for others, for many countries, they don't have this driver at all. They don't see these weapons in that way. But for some countries, this idea of nuclear weapons is what has driven the proliferation, be that a vertical or horizontal proliferation at any given time. And this is also true with the concept of extended deterrence. So even those countries that don't possess nuclear weapons, but consider themselves to be under some kind of protection from protection by nuclear weapons, maybe from nuclear weapons or maybe from conventional weapons, but underneath this so-called umbrella, then these countries also have the same view of nuclear weapons, even though they may not possess them themselves. And one of the biggest problems, I think, that we're seeing in disarmament discourse today is addressing the fears of those countries, the fears that the extended nuclear deterrence that they have set so much store by may be diminished or taken from them. And that comes with it a whole set of other fears. Very little often to do with real security, in that a conventional deterrence would probably be all that would be required. But nonetheless a very emotional problem for many countries. So my hypothesis is that the deterrence discourse is a major proliferation driver. And the idea that nuclear weapons prevent conflict is likely to ensure their attractiveness to states that are vulnerable in conflict regions. And so they will either seek nuclear weapons, or they will seek the capability for nuclear weapons, or they will seek some form of protection if they buy into this idea and if they are vulnerable. And this is a problem for all nuclear weapons possessors. How is it possible for us to consider to talk about going to zero, whether that be in the context of Article 6 of the NPT or whether that be in the context of a long-standing determination for a global zero? How is it possible to talk about zero if we at the same time say that nuclear weapons provide the ultimate guarantee? Why shouldn't everyone have that ultimate guarantee, either through their own means or through extension? So if we look at risks, the highest risk for everyone, be it nuclear or not, is actually the risk of conflict in terms of our world in which we're dealing. I mean, obviously there are higher risks for our livelihoods in terms of other security issues, health security, food security, security from climate change, etc. All of those are major risks. I don't put these necessarily any higher than those. But the risk of conflict is an extremely high risk for many of us. And history says that that risk will always remain. That risk is high and will remain. It has been decreasing, though, over millennia. And that's partly because we've learned about how to prevent conflict. There are many ways in which we can prevent conflicts from becoming violent. And we've learned a great deal about how to do that. Not just in the last few decades, not just since the UN, but we've learned a lot in the past. And nuclear weapons clearly play little role in conflict prevention. And we've seen many instances where they've played no role at all, even though they're in existence. And there is very little evidence, hard evidence, and that's the type of evidence that as a physicist I require, that says that they have a role even in preventing nuclear war. And that doesn't mean that they don't have a role, it's just that there's no real evidence, or very little real evidence. We can have an argue about a few data points, but they're very few. So the idea, however, that they do prevent conflict is what is, I think, at the root of driving proliferation. And connected with that, I've talked about extended deterrence, but the other side of that is security assurances, negative security assurances. And this includes no first use and no use policies, which I see as security assurances. And I would say that one of the biggest problems we have, if I might divert just a second from the issue over Crimea, is not the issue of nuclear weapons. It's the issue of security assurances. The Budapest Memorandum was a security assurance signed on the day that Ukraine became a party to the NPT. And that has just been driven through in terms of respecting territorial integrity. It was also in breach because it doesn't also allow economic leverage against Ukraine. So we've not put the issue of security assurances at all high on our agenda. And it always intrigues me as to why it is that states set so much more store by positive security assurances, those assurances where you would use nuclear weapons to protect, to defend, rather than negative security assurances. What is the difference between the two, and how do we bolster those in order to prevent proliferation? So the questions I think we have in terms of the risks of proliferation is, if we get further proliferation both vertically and horizontally, are we likely to see increased risk of nuclear weapons use? Because that in the end is what really counts. One of the things that has, I think, made a lot of us pause in recent months is the use of chemical weapons in Syria. I'm not going to go into all of the details of that and what happened afterwards, but I think that if you see the use of weapons of mass destruction in today's conflicts as possible, and in fact actually happened, you have to ask yourself very, very sincerely, how likely is it in a conflict that nuclear weapons might be used at some point in that conflict? I don't think we can rule it out. And I think that the spread and the increase of nuclear weapons capability may make that more likely. At Chatham House, we've been looking at a risk study. We've been developing a risk approach to the use of nuclear weapons, and we've been studying a set of examples in history where nuclear weapons were very nearly used, and one individual or a few individuals decided not to use them. In fact, the joke is, of course, that there's more evidence for the hand of God in those decisions than there is for nuclear deterrence. We don't know whether this is the tip of the iceberg, but one of the things that we have done in our risk calculations is we're looking also at some of the information that's coming out in terms of sloppy practice from the US, from the UK, from France and others. And I don't wish to single those countries out because I doubt that they're unique at all. It's just they're more open with information. We don't know whether this is the tip of the iceberg, but we are very concerned that, in fact, our perception of, our understanding of what the probabilities are has been too low. It's been underestimated. And we also know from the work that's being done now on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons that our perception of consequences was too low. And so what has happened as a result of that is that our risk calculation has increased. We'll be publishing this report in a few weeks. To conclude then, unless we reduce the risks, and in trying to reduce the risks of proliferation, we have to address the underlying causes and the belief systems and unpack them in a way that we move towards eliminating nuclear weapons rather than actually increasing the likelihood of proliferation. Thank you.
Patricia, thank you.